Okay, we have a really packed schedule, and we're really excited about it. But that means we're going to keep the introductions really extremely short. So I want to thank Paavo Pylkkanen, who came here all the way from Finland, and he has worked with David Bohm and is a really extraordinary philosopher in this area. And let's welcome Paavo Pylkkanen.
Okay, so thank you very much, and great honor to start. Right. Okay. Get started here. Yeah. And really, here I was thinking, actually, pretty hard preparing the talk, and I must say that. I studied a lot of so-called ordinary cognitive neuroscience articles during July just to get an idea of this revolution or the need for it. Anyway, so when we talk about scientific revolutions in philosophy of science, we think of Thomas Kuhn, who wrote that scientific revolutions are inaugurated by a growing sense, often restricted to a narrow subdivision of the scientific community, that an existing paradigm has ceased to function adequately in the exploration of an aspect of nature to which that paradigm itself had previously led the way. So we could ask, has mainstream cognitive neuroscience ceased to function adequately in the exploration of consciousness, so that it is time for a revolution? And I think there is no sort of simple answer here, but we'll start exploring this. Now, I just thought I'd say a little bit about from the philosophy of science perspective of the Kuhnian model. So this is the picture of the way a science progresses. So before science proper, there's something we might call pre-science, which then turns into normal science, and which you encounter a crisis, you get a revolution, new normal science, new crisis. So this is like a cycle. It's one way of understanding how science progresses over the ages. And so in the early phase, you might say that what we have is a disorganized and diverse activity. But then when things get more structured and directed, we have this, what we might call a single paradigm in the scientific community. And this is, of course, I've been thinking about that when looking at this. If we think about consciousness studies, we might again say, well, is it disorganized? They're certainly diverse. There are very many approaches, as we will see. And so it's really the question of whether, at what stage in the Kuhnian cycle we are. Are we still at pre-science when it comes to consciousness studies, or to have this revolution, then maybe we have to, science has to be in a fairly advanced stage. But anyway, so what is this paradigm? It's made of general theoretical assumptions and laws and the techniques for their application. Okay? And this further component of paradigms involves some very general metaphysical principles. So for example, in the Newtonian paradigm, there was the idea of the physical world as a mechanical system, and where forces were important. And in the Cartesian program, there was the idea of this big clockwork, and all forces take the form of a push. So I guess the Newtonian forces looked a bit ghostly in the Cartesian paradigm. So in that sense, they're rather different. And then in paradigms, you also have this methodological prescription. So which have to do with trying to match the paradigm with nature, and also if you fail, if there are falsifications, you should take them seriously. And so what's this normal science? The idea there is that these normal scientists, they articulate and develop the paradigm. They try to account for and accommodate the behavior or some relevant aspects of the real world. And Kuhn thought that when you do this normal science, then scientists will inevitably experience difficulties and encounter apparent falsifications. So you see, with Kuhn, it was partly he was trying to describe how science works, but I think he also felt it's a good thing. I mean, maybe this is the way it should work, in the sense that, the normal science may sound very boring, why can't we have a revolution every day? But Kuhn felt, no, I mean, we must have this fairly conservative and perhaps even boring activity in science, because this is the way to actually go forward in the end and find the genuine difficulties. Now, and if you have these difficulties and they get out of hand, you will get into a crisis state. And so how is it resolved? Well, you get an entirely new paradigm with its supporters, and then it's this kind of this continuous change that would constitute the scientific revolution. And now we have a new paradigm which again leads to a new period of normal science. So I mean, this is, of course, this is just Kuhnian model. A lot of people, of course, as in everything in philosophy, people criticize it. But I think it's still at least as nice to have as a background here. So we could ask things like, does the Kuhnian picture fit with contemporary consciousness studies? And in this conference, we refer to a revolution. And so to have a crisis and a revolution in the Kuhnian sense, we should be able to identify a paradigm and serious anomalies in consciousness studies. And of course, this thing in the background, let's have a look at the state of the art in contemporary consciousness studies. Now, what is the mainstream, if we can talk about the mainstream in conscious studies? I don't know if it would be fair to say that the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, ASSC, presents the mainstream, because they take, in some ways, they take a fairly kind of conservative approach, or, so for example, they don't include quantum approaches. I mean, this, and Dave Chalmers mentioned that it's just too kind of French for that. So maybe that's the mainstream. And it's the article by Seth and Bain, that's a pretty cool review. I'd say it's a brilliant review. It doesn't mean I agree, even with the approach they've taken, but it's just a very, they've really done a good job there. They actually present a selection of 22 theories of consciousness and say that our selection of theories includes those that are either neurobiological in nature or potentially expressible in neurobiological terms. Okay, and here we won't go through all of them, but I've just to give you an idea of what these 22 approaches are, so you will recognize some of the familiar ones, and then some of them are kind of maybe modifications, and some are even, there's the higher order and global workspace, IIT, and so on and so forth. And they even mention the or-chor, last but not the least, in the list. Although they do say that they are not, in the review, they are not discussing quantum approaches. I mean, they do give the references, but anyway, so you can see, I mean, if this is a mainstream theories of consciousness, if we look at it like that, it doesn't look like there's a single paradigm there, okay? But anyway, in the review, they actually then they group theories into 4 categories, and the idea is that these are then the, I suppose this would be maybe representatives of the prevailing paradigm. I understand that toward the end of the conference there'll be a discussion of theories of consciousness with Kelvin McQueen and others, so I think these ideas will be discussed more then, but I'm just, in a way, what I'm saying here will hopefully also connect to the end of the conference. Now, of course, so we could say, are these in some ways representatives of this prevailing paradigm, and do they have limitations and problems which justify the need for a revolution? And here is just, I pretty much picked these from the Seth and Bain article. I won't go through this in detail, but in the case of high order theories, the idea is that the mental state is conscious in virtue of being the target of a certain kind of meta-representational state. And in this picture you can see that the meta-representations is frontal, and then the lower order representation is posterior. And the idea is that these high-order theories, they are challenged by evidence suggesting that anterior areas are not involved in consciousness, perhaps necessary only for enabling subjective report and executive control. Again, showing how difficult it is to study consciousness because people are measuring the so-called neural correlates of consciousness, so it may be we don't actually know what we are measuring. Are we measuring consciousness or some non-conscious processes? Somewhat similarly with the global workspace theories, here the idea is that the mental states are conscious when they are broadcast within a global workspace in which frontoparietal networks play a central hub-like role. And these are challenged by evidence that anterior regions might be involved in behavioral report rather than consciousness per se. Again, the same kind of point that we don't know actually what exactly, how the evidence should be interpreted. There is one theory which is in some ways a different kind of theory, but it's still got a lot of attention recently, where we think of consciousness as identical to the cause-effect structure of a physical system that specifies a maximum of irreducible integrated information. Okay. Okay. All right. So, would it be? Okay. So anyway, and so if we say consciousness is identical to the cause-effect structure of a physical system that specifies a maximum of irreducible integrated information, then here, of course, we're saying that consciousness has more to do with information rather than, let's say, a specific brain process or okay. And here one of the criticisms would be that actually this quantity phi is very difficult to measure, and there you could have also other ones. Let's see what I. Okay. Finally, there is this reentry theory and predictive processing, where the idea is that conscious mental states are associated with top-down signaling that convey predictions about causes of sensory signals. And there's another, again, one thing that would challenge these theories. So, I mean, there are these kind of potential. The idea is here that either we already have evidence that questions some of these theories, or we know what kind of evidence would question them. So they are making specific enough claims so that some sort of falsification might be possible. I mean, this is one of the ideas. This is not Thomas Kuhn, it's Karl Popper's idea that what's important in science is that we make testable hypotheses, and to be testable, they have to be specific, and so this way, the question is always, when we are evaluating these theories, how specific are the predictions that they're making? Okay. And just to keep up, stay with the mainstream. Remember, what I want to do is a little bit, before moving on to the revolution, I felt that we really have to look at the established paradigm, okay? And the Templeton Foundation has been funding these so-called adversarial collaboration, where two theories come together, design experiments that would test between them, and then hopefully through falsification, the science of consciousness would be progressing. And this is the Cognitate Consortium. So you see all these people over here. You said philosophers, even there, David Chalmers, maybe some of the other ones, and there's everybody there, Chanonian, Dehaenen, Christoph Koch, and Lyot Mudrik. So, Cognitate Consortium, I mean, this is actually now, I get the link there, but you can actually, it's not yet peer-reviewed, but you can already read this report. The idea that there was this big team, the consortium who did the study, so these people were supposed to be neutral with respect to theories, so they were not supporters of the theories. And they say there were several challenges for both theories. Here I just mentioned a couple of them. For IIT, the lack of sustained synchronization within posterior cortex represents the most direct challenge, and for GNWT, the most significant challenge pertains to its account for the maintenance of a conscious person over time, and in particular the lack of ignition and stimulus offset. But, surprise, surprise, then when the representatives of IIT and GNWT get to speak, they don't think at all that these challenges are so significant. So it's very interesting also sociologically to read, because in this document they present all the studies, you have the neutral group saying what they think, and then you also have the supporters of IIT and afterwards GNWT. So, for example, the IIT people would say that the results corroborate IIT's overall claim that posterior cortical areas are sufficient for consciousness, and neither the involvement of prefrontal cortex nor global broadcasting are necessary. Okay, so in a way. Whereas our friend Stanislas Dehaene, who is global neural and workspace theory, he kind of say, okay, some results do challenge GNWT, but they do not seem unsurmountable given experimental limitations. And then he goes actually to compare the predictions of these two theories. He says, there is a considerable asymmetry in the specificity of the theory's predictions. None of the massive mathematical backbone of IIT, such as the phi measure of awareness, was tested in the present experiment. Instead, what are presented as unique predictions of IIT are just what any physiologist familiar with the bottom-up response properties of those regions would predict, since visual neurons still respond selectively during inattention or general anesthesia. And then such posterior stimulus-specific duration-dependent responses are equally predicted by GNWT, but attributed to non-conscious processing. I'm not an expert on neuroscience, but when I was reading this, I was wondering, well, why didn't he say this before they did the experiments? I mean, they spent, what, 2.5 million? 5 million Templeton money. I mean, it kind of feels, either he did or did not, but maybe they make then another, maybe in the next experiment they will test conscious versus non-conscious and see whether it makes a difference to these posterior regions. But, of course, it's easy to be kind of critical and perhaps a bit cynical. These are difficult things. People are doing great work, hard work, but still, just looking at this, although sometimes for us who do in the so-called quantum approaches camp, we may feel that on the other side there's this group of so-called mainstream people who all agree about almost everything. Now, this is not really the case. There is quite even strong disagreements. Okay? So anyway, so in contemporary consciousness studies, the mainstream disagree amongst themselves, at times radically, which again we could ask, well, does it mean that consciousness studies is still at the pre-paradigmatic stage? Or could we say that, we've all heard about the neural correlates of consciousness. Would the search for them, which has been going on for 30 years, would that be kind of characterize a paradigm? Perhaps more like a methodology, but still, everybody who feels that the way to understand consciousness is to study those neural correlates, are they part of the same paradigm? And doing my sort of homework for this talk, I found out that even here there are disputes. So here are these three, Klein, Howe, and Bain again. They introduced this idea of difference makers as important. And it's a very interesting article. They say that the NCC, Neural Correlates of Consciousness framework, presupposes a particular and implausible conception of the structure of consciousness. Drawing on so-called interventionist accounts of explanation, they suggest that the goals of consciousness science would be best served by focusing on difference-making relations. So the science of consciousness should replace the search for the neural correlates of consciousness with the search for the difference makers of consciousness. Now, I won't go into it, but this is again just to illustrate that these people are challenging really this thing that very many people have taken as granted or just assumed to be the important thing. Okay? Okay. So let's go back and ask, does the Kuhnian picture fit with contemporary consciousness studies? Is consciousness studies still at the pre-paradigmatic stage? You see, we could say, in some ways, perhaps yes, but then again, many of the studies are done in a very professional way, and the theories are constructed in a very high quality way, and so on and so forth. So it's not this kind of, in some ways, it's not at least a pre-scientific situation. Well, and perhaps sort of moving more toward the themes of this meeting, we could then ask, regardless of their difference, do the mainstream theories have enough in common to define a paradigm? Remember, one thing with a paradigm, one aspect of paradigm is that it includes a common metaphysical assumptions. And I wonder if this could be the paradigm of mainstream consciousness studies, something like this. Consciousness is going to be explained in a completely mechanistic way in a neural framework that makes no reference to quantum theory, that is, within a classical physics framework. And because this seems to be like often when you read the literature, people are not discussing it in this way, but it's kind of implicit that they are looking for very mechanistic explanations. And so, and you see what we could say, we can argue that the hard problem of consciousness is a serious anomaly for the mechanistic paradigm in consciousness studies. And I would actually say that this is why many in the mainstream want to put the hard problem under the carpet. I mean, for example, Anil Seth talked about the real problem. So he's very good at advocating this thing. You know, we got the real problem, and maybe the hard problem, yes, we may never solve it and all that. But like, he's not too willing to look into something like quantum approaches. I think within the so-called mainstream, I don't know, not many people are, but I've noticed Christoph Koch in a few occasions. He's actually open to, he at least mentions the quantum properties, and he even did that in the ASSC conference in New York when they were having the event discussing, there was actually the bet between David Chalmers and Christoph Koch about neural correlates of consciousness. So even there, Christoph mentioned that it could be intrinsic quantum properties that could be the neural correlate. So it's not, and it was nice to have the forbidden thing coming from one of the main guys, because it was allegedly not so. The two French things. It's good if the thought leaders start expressing the so-called forbidden ideas. But anyway, I think with Anil, I once talked with him in a party in Sweden, and I found out that he probably was at some stage rather interested in the quantum approaches, but then he moved on, and so he wouldn't find it there. But of course, so what is the hard problem? So it's the problem of explaining how and why physical processes give rise to consciousness. And David Chalmers talks also about that, can we have a transparent explanation in the sense that we understand why it necessarily, if it's a physical explanation, why a certain physical process necessarily gives rise to consciousness, that it's really, we can understand it. Dave doesn't think so, so he would think that we need what he calls a generative account, where we have some psychophysical laws, which in certain situations will then give rise to consciousness. But we have to assume those laws. But anyway, I think this is it's quite, there are people who try to understand and even answer to the hard problem in various ways, but I don't think they are so far terribly successful when they try to do that within this mechanistic paradigm. I mean, they're very clever ones. If you read somebody like Graziano, they are very interesting and fascinating papers, but in the end, at least, I think they're just not correct. But I mean, that, of course, has to be argued for. But. So we could ask, getting towards the end, we could ask, will bringing in quantum theory help to understand consciousness and the hard problem? Now, I think in this conference we will hear a lot about recent advances within the Penrose and Hameroff's OR theory of consciousness, so I won't talk about that so much now. Just mention that there are many other attempts to make use of quantum theory to tackle the problem of consciousness and the mind-body problem more generally. And my own focus has been on the physicists David Bohm and Basil Hiley's ontological interpretation of quantum theory, and also Bohm's implicate order framework, which tries to bring together quantum theory and relativity, and also as a general framework include biological, psychological, and social phenomena. And Bohm died in 92, right, sort of roughly at the time when the consciousness studies became big. So he didn't write so much about consciousness, but he did, of course, see that in the implicate order framework there would be a room for consciousness in another way than you would have it in a more mechanistic paradigm. So this is some work he did also with Carl Pribram with the holographic brain, and so where you bring in certain sort of more holistic principles, and also some radical ideas of the physical world. So, for example, ideas such as things that pre-space would be fundamental, something that Wheeler suggested, and and also I think it's quite a lot in current philosophy of physics. So maybe some features of consciousness sort of fit in this kind of framework. But this is the ontological interpretation. It's a summary. It's a slide by Basil Hiley. And the point here is just that let me see. Wow, I never used it. So what Bohm showed back in '52 is that you can actually write quantum mechanics in a form which allows you to calculate trajectories, and to explain these trajectories, introduce this sort of quantum potential. But the new thing here was that if you look at the mathematical expression, the quantum potential only depends on the form of the amplitude of this wave, or the second spatial derivative. So Bohm was saying that it's really informing the particle. So his idea was that a quantum object is a particle guided by a field of information, and this is semantic active information for the electron, and not Shannon information, which would be information for us, typically. And this can be seen as a primitive mind-like quality of elementary particles. I mean, this is what Bohm himself said. He would also say that the electrons are not conscious, but maybe the origin of consciousness in complex physical systems is intimately connected with the quantum active information of the particles constituting the system. And I would say that this is clearly a radical paradigm shift, because by suggesting that electrons have primitive mind-like qualities, we are radically changing our concept of the physical world. The philosopher Gallen Strawson talks about physicsalism, which is like saying that we have to take physics seriously in our physicalism. And if we would go along with Bohm, then we would have a new kind of physicalism, where something mind-like is already very much part of matter, what we call matter, or the physical. Yeah. Anyway, so the challenge is then to explain how such quantum active information and information possibly emergent from it becomes conscious, where possible answers would be back actions suggested by Jack Sarfati, or high-order relations, which is something like Bohm himself. I find both of them interesting in some ways, but perhaps neither is sort of fully convincing, so I think more work has to be done. But anyway, thank you very much. There is Etna, and now we have the hurricane coming. Right, thank you very much.